Thanks for tuning in to Stay Sharp with Razorleaf, your secret weapon for all things digital in products and manufacturing. Today's episode, we welcome Annalise Suzuki, who is the Vice President of Technology and Engagement at Elysium, a company focused on 3D data operability. Annalise, Jonathan, and Jen take us through the paces of the similarities and differences when migrating CAD data versus PLM data, and how often they go hand in hand when it comes to data migration. Are there special considerations when consolidating PLM systems, CAD systems, or even CAD formats? Tune in with the team and discover how, in many cases, the similarities outweigh the differences.
Welcome back, everybody, to Stay Sharp, the podcast about all things digital related to products and manufacturing. I am here with Jonathan, my co-host.
Hi, everybody.
And I guess I should add, I am Jen Farilla. It's amazing how many times I forget to introduce myself. Today, we are here talking about data migration. And it's another time where I've learned that terminology is important, because when I joined Razorleaf, my definition of data migration was completely different than what it means here at Razorleaf. So we have one of our guests today joining us is Annalise Suzuki. Sorry, Annalise. Annalise is the Vice President of Technology and Engagement at Elysium, a company that knows just a little bit about one of my favorite subjects, 3D data interoperability. And Annalise and Jonathan are going to help us explore the two different sides of migration. So Annalise, you want to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and Elysium?
Sure, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Jen and Jonathan, for inviting me. Definitely a topic that I love to talk about, because there's a lot of devil in the detail when it comes to migration. So for those that are, heard about Elysium maybe for the first time, we are focused on CAD-related interoperability, which is CAD conversion and related kinds of things. So migration falls in that sector for us. And I know for Razorleaf, there's more on the PLM side. So when you put the two together, a lot of similarities and a lot of differences, actually. But a lot of times they go hand in hand, because we find that many of our customers actually need to migrate both CAD and PLM. So it's good to understand both sides of the equation, I think.
I agree. And that's where we usually start, or where we often find ourselves starting, is kind of defining what we're talking about so that our listeners all have the right terminology, so they're not getting confused with what data migration is, like I did when I joined. So I'm going to have you each maybe we can do kind of a counterpoint sort of conversation here, where Annalise, I'd like you to describe a little bit what we mean by CAD data migration, and then we can have Jonathan jump in with what we mean by PLM data migration. We'll just kind of go from there.
Sure. So from the CAD migration perspective, what we talk about is moving CAD systems. So typically it's going to be moving off of one system and onto a new system. So let's say a company uses a system that's basically going out of support. Maybe it's considered legacy, and that CAD vendor is no longer going to, provide support for that. So it's time to really move that to some format that is fully supported by their CAD vendor. So moving from, let's say, something like Ideas is kind of a legacy system from Siemens, either moving that to NX or possibly some other CAD system if a company has multiple systems. Some other use cases might be consolidating CAD formats. So they might have different divisions, and they decided it's time to really standardize everything into one. Other use cases could be, for example, merges or acquisitions, whereas the company is growing, but they don't necessarily want to grow tools and processes and best practices and all of the methodology that might have kind of started out into one place. So those are the types of things that come up when we're talking about CAD migration, and talking about typical CAD systems like CATIA V5, NX, 3D Experience, SolidWorks, Creo, so on and so forth.
Yes, I'll jump in and say, on the PLM front, I think when we talk about PLM data migrations, a lot of times we're saying things like migrating CAD data, but mean something different than what Annalise just said. So when we talk about CAD data migration in that PLM context, we're talking about taking files like from an example like Annalise described, like a CATIA, and moving it from one management system to another, but not changing the fact that it's CATIA data, right? So, and with PLM data migrations, it may be more than just moving that CAD data from one management system to another, or even into a management system, right? Like Annalise described, there are a couple of different use cases you run into in these. So sometimes it's not from one PLM to another PLM. Sometimes it's from a file system into a PLM, or from a couple of different systems into one to merge them or something like that. But other things we might be talking about when we talk about PLM data migration are the kinds of content that may actually be authored in a PLM system. So sometimes it's moving the data that PLM tool houses and manages, like CAD content, drawings, models, trying to think of other things, simulation data, things like that. But sometimes it may be information that's authored in a particular PLM tool, like a bill of material, right? An engineering bill, a manufacturing bill, a workflow process, things like that. And that can be a little bit tricky and a little bit different in a couple of ways. But I think that's the ballpark of what we're talking about. And like you said, Jen, how those are easily confused, but are somewhat different. And of course, are still interrelated.
Right. And I think, a lot of the reasons that you do migrations tend to be fairly similar. It's either you're upgrading your, if in the case of a CAD system, like Annalise said, or same thing happens with PLM systems, right? Those kind of go out of date or get shifted to this is the newest and latest, greatest, or, business expansion, consolidation, et cetera. So it sounds like from what you guys are saying, one of the primary differences is the types of data. In not so much, you're both talking about CAD in some cases, but I don't know, how would you characterize that? Because when you said PLM, it is more than just the CAD design data.
Right. But in the case, the confusing case, right, the one that you're pointing to is like, well, if I talk about migrating CAD data in a PLM context and Annalise talks about migrating CAD data in the CAD context, what do we mean? Why are we talking about something different, right? And so I'll start and I'll hand it over to you, Annalise. It's from the PLM perspective, it's thinking of the data that might be in those files or containers, right? In some cases, like these days, when we start to deal with databases, maybe we're dealing with a different kind of container. But whatever the data is, we look at it as, it's in a container mostly, and not thinking about what's inside that container. Let's get that container from here to there, right? And on your side, Annalise, I think you see it differently, right?
Very differently when you bring it up that way. It's because, I like the analogy. It's in a container and you move that whole container, like house A to house B when you're moving, right? And in our sense, we're talking about the rules around the container are completely different. So it's the conversion aspect, not just migration, that really starts to come into play. And that's where I think, like when I mentioned the devil in the detail, especially when we're talking about a CAD conversion in conjunction with the migration, it really means we care about how that CAD model will be used. Is it going to be sustained for long-term, just sustainment and service? Or is it actually going to go through like active engineering changes, whereas a company needs to touch the model, change it, rev it up, and those kinds of things? Because now that affects requirements a lot. And we have to care about whether we're preserving feature history or associativity in the drawings and things like that. And I'm sure you have similar kinds of requirements, but on a PLM side, but that's what they start to look like when we're starting to scope out, okay, you have a migration, what kind of things do you care about and do you need? And that's where the discussion starts to go from understanding a CAD level migration in terms of requirements and objectives.
I want to dig into that for a second, Annalise, if I could. Excuse me. Because I think you brought up an important term that some of our audience, I know it's going to resonate with them. They're like, oh, yep, I get it. And then lots of our audience may say, wait, I'm not a CAD expert. I don't know what you mean. And I want to back up to that to sort of maybe level set for people. If we backed up 30 years in CAD, 40 years in CAD and said, well, what was CAD? A lot of times it was drawings before we had a lot of models. And when people would think about changing formats, it was, well, system A maybe represents the lines and arcs on a drawing, a 2D drawing, one way, and system B represents it a different way. And that conversion is about helping them understand how to go from one to the other. But when we started getting into modeling and we got into things like feature-based modeling and parametric modeling, let me try that again. When we got into things like feature-based modeling and parametric modeling, suddenly it wasn't about just the lines and arcs. It was about how you did something, how you made a model, and different softwares would do it different ways. And that's when you mentioned feature-based, right? And the requirements around that. Can you just speak to that for a minute? Like, why does that matter?
Yeah.
Why is that a big deal?
Yeah, because if someone is looking to make an engineering change, typically they'll need to access the feature history in order to do that. So let's say they want to, edit a hole size or a length of something. And if they do a migration without caring about the features, you can't really touch it. You're just preserving the geometry as it was for, use going forward, but not for changes. So the features, the reason it becomes, it gets pretty involved really fast. And this is where Elysium kind of really stands out in terms of knowledge and expertise. The features from one CAD system to another tend to be different because they each have their own proprietary mathematical kernel behind the algorithms that make the geometry. So if I were to, make an extrude or even a hole in a cylinder, those are all made up of sort of a set of features. And like you said, they're not necessarily equal, or they may appear equal, but the way to achieve them is done in a different order. So that's where it gets really complicated really fast. And the funny thing is, features do become very valuable when you do need to make edits and actively make changes on models. But a lot of times companies don't need all the feature history for every model. And it's a lot of complication, if you don't need it. So it's really important to understand, what do I need these for? What are my high IP parts, or what are the ones that are really actively going to go through changes? A lot of parts are purchased or, not expected to change. So that it's funny because sometimes we find that customers will naturally say, "Oh, I need everything. I can't lose anything." And I'm sure you hear the same thing.
Absolutely.
We do. And it's this gut reaction, yes, I need all the features and I need all the drawings. And you think about, moving a house, there's a lot of stuff.
Do you need all of that stuff? Can you leave some of it
We
behind?
really didn't even know we had, right? So, but it's a reality, and the features can become extremely valuable to migrate them. But it's important to understand when you need them and why you need them to not necessarily add complication in the equation of CAD migration.
Yeah, it's a lot like my garage, right? When I move houses, I should not move everything in the garage. But if I take a minute to think about what I really need, maybe I'll bring the right stuff, to your point.
But maybe you need it all. You don't know.
Well, that's the problem. There's one that I know is in common between these kinds of migrations, right? Annalise is, yeah.
Well, and
but you never know. You might need it. You got to bring it.
Well, and we do run into that, right? So I know that's one of the things we consider when you're removing files is okay, how many revisions of that file do you need? Do you need just the most recent, or do you need to go back to the very beginning?
That's right. I mean, and it relates to the requirement Annalise just mentioned about, do you need to change it? Do you need to edit it? Right. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's, well, I do, and I need to go back to the history because I need a point in time of when I did something to it. But sometimes it's, well, no, I just need to edit it going forward. And maybe I've got, one of these direct modeling tools that would let me do that. I just bring the geometry, I forget the history, but I can still edit it. Or maybe, no, that's not the right thing. But, I think Annalise said the magic word, which is requirements. What are the requirements? And that's something that is definitely in common across these kinds of migrations.
One other thing I wonder if it's in common is when you're assessing the requirements, you need to take a look at the data itself too, right? Not just what data you have, but what kind of shape is it in? Because I know for a fact that we run into broken links and all kinds of problems on the PLM side. And I know from even more experience that there's a lot of crappy design data out there that once you try to translate it or convert it, it just blows things up. So is that another similarity?
Yeah, and for us, what we recommend when a customer's really kind of had a minute to understand what they think they need for migration, and has had a chance to kind of assess their expectations, just on paper, knowing kind of who they are as a company, what their products are, what they expect to do after a migration. We typically recommend, okay, you're going to find sample data that is representing your true scenario. And it's really important that they find something that represents what they're actually going to migrate. Not the biggest, baddest, ugliest assembly. Like some
And
people
not the
try to think,
easiest,
if you
also.
can do this, you can get anything. Yeah. But
Right.
it just throws off the expectation and, performance. And so when you're trying to really plan a project realistically, that's important. And sometimes they don't want to give anything away, so they oversimplify the data, which has the opposite effect, because now we're running metrics and it's like really fast. And then they're like, well, I thought this would be done. And, so it's really good to have, a nice representation that represents like the types of features, the number of features, the complexity, assemblies, parts, and drawings if they're all part of the equation. And even if they've got multiple CAD systems that are all getting migrated to one, for example, they need to understand data examples from each of those. You can't just run, Inventor and then assume it's going to be similar enough from SolidWorks and CATIA, for example. It doesn't work that way. So it's really important to take each kind of scenario, break it up. And then what we do is we recommend, you run kind of a benchmark or even just a proof of concept to start from that conversion aspect. And once they see that, and it's important, like we recommend also they bring it out of, if it isn't a PLM system to start, bring it out as you would, convert and bring it in. And you have to kind of test out that entire thing. And that really is critical. I mean, I think a lot of companies try to get their plan together before they do that. And it's almost not really helpful because
it's just going to waste time, right?
Yeah. So is it similar for you guys? I mean, do you have to run some pilots like that to kind of prove out the time of the project on migration side or on
Absolutely.
the PLM side? Or
Absolutely. There are probably some things that make that timing requirement a little different, or can, because with a CAD tool, I think sometimes, correct me if I'm wrong, you could take one or two users, or a certain area and do certain areas at a time and sort of spread out whatever your performance issue might be. A lot of times when there's system migrations, it's tough to spread that out because you're like, well, that one has to be shut down on Monday and this one has to be turned on, or shut down on Friday. This one has to be turned on Monday, and you've got the weekend. And that's it. Everybody has to go at once, right? But there are techniques in PLM that let you move a little bit at a time too. But that performance issue is absolutely one that we have to pay attention to. And what you said is exactly the right advice. Think about the process, plan out the process. Don't just plan a piece of it. We're going to move this. It's really easy. And we'll look at the cleanest data possible. And it's fine. But you have to think about all of the elements that are going to be part of the total plan. And you have to rehearse, right? Yeah. To your point, you need to rehearse. You need to find the warts in the data, maybe clean up some data. You have to find the problems in your process and whatever your plan was, because your plan won't be perfect. And you have to try a couple of times before you're ready to say, okay, let's do this.
That brings up an interesting point. So how do you know, like as you're going through, whether it's a proof of concept or a pilot or rehearsals on the PLM side, how do you know that the data is valid once you've got it there? Is there a way to go through it? Like, do you test that? Do you validate it? I know Elysium does some stuff on the CAD side of things, but I'm a little less sure on how we validate links and all the data on the PLM side of things.
I'll let Annalise start because I think you guys do have really neat tools for this.
Sure. Yeah. So we do a QA on the result compared with the source model. And that's kind of built into our CAD feature platform, which is the migration tool. So basically we read the data in, we, migrate to the target format, and then we basically do a comparison of the before and after and report out a nice comprehensive report that has surface area difference, centroid difference, maximum deviation. There's a number of stats that will be recorded. So if, for example, there was a difference in, the kernels enough that affected the geometry or the features and anything, that will be recorded in the QA report, and users would know, like, this one's yellow. What's going on here? This one's red. But they'll be able to see if there's something that they need to take action on, or just take note of.
Right.
So and that's really important because data is so critical for so many processes. I mean, it's really an asset. So I strongly feel that the QA is so important as part of any kind of migration, because now you can trust that it's usable as expected. But, if you don't have a process or a plan for that QA, like, it's really dangerous, I think. So, and I'm curious to know about, more of the QA on the PLM side.
Sure. And I'll say it's it's spotty is what it is, right? There are tools that we've used for some automated validation, right? And a lot of what happens in PLM migrations is about just logging, and they're sort of binary kinds of answers. Yes, that worked. No, it didn't. And because a lot of the processes of what we're moving can be very custom, it's like, well, I generally can move this bill of material to that bill of material in this system to that system. But the variety of these migrations, I think, and you might tell me I'm wrong, Annalise, but is much higher, right? Because it's about, I guess, a larger number of combinations of file system A to PLM B and PDM X to PLM C. And then when you start talking about merging, and by the way, each of these systems can represent data in different ways, even if they're from the same vendor, right? Take 3D Experience, right? And say, well, when it was Matrix 1, and now that it's 3D Experience, under the hood, same stuff, right? At its core, under the hood, there's some things that are similar. You took versions across 15 years and they look totally different in terms of the data model and those kinds of things. So all that variety, I think, leads us to, even though we have toolkits that we use for migration, there are lots of folks out there who have toolkits for that kind of thing. You're still doing it one-off. So when you think about validation, a lot of times you're thinking, well, do I have something in my toolkit to help with validation? But the actual validation process can be different each time. If I'm checking workflows, it might look one way. If I'm checking bills of material, it may look a different way. And I think the thing that maybe we have in common there is that the techniques that you learn about how to do it are important. And then you have to go apply those principles and techniques to your situation. Like, don't check in the same way that you used to do the process, right? So use sort of an independent validation path, right? So those kinds of things are probably similar, but there are so many different validation, I think, tools and techniques that we've used that, it's hard to even describe, right? I mean, some of it's like, put them side by side. And anyway.
Well, and that's what you can do with geometry. And that's one of the things when we were talking about different data types that as difficult and as challenging as I know CAD data translation is, and I could talk for hours on how complicated that is, it's in the end, it's geometric data that you're getting from one place to another. Versus with PLM data migrations, you're talking about CAD design data, you're talking about BOMs, you're talking about workflows, you're talking about, drawings, like documents, specifications, et cetera. So finding one test fits all as far as a validation has got to be really challenging.
I think it is. And I think I want to go back to something that Annalise said, that there's a really important nugget there that I like what you said a lot about trust, right? And validation, and how critical that is to being able to trust the data on the backside when you're done with the project. And for our audience, I don't know if people have thought about this already. Maybe I'm slow to the game here, but the idea that you might do a project, and these can be expensive projects, right? The tools are not always inexpensive, and it takes quite a bit of time and effort to do it. But to spend all that money and then to find that people aren't going to trust the result means that you've wasted the money, right? And I've certainly seen that. Excuse me. Man. I've certainly seen that on the PLM and PDM side with migrations. I suspect you've seen the same, Annalise, where I've even seen it on a CAD migration, actually, where someone spent the time and effort to migrate the CAD data. And then when the engineers went to use it, they were like, well, it's not quite right, or it's not really editable. It's just easier for me to remodel. And then you're like, why? Why did we do all this?
That reminds me of something we see a lot, actually. I mean, like, I shouldn't say now, but we have seen in the past, especially a lot of times when there's a CAD migration, it's, users are very kind of religious to their CAD system. I mean, they are attached. It's kind of like, that first love of whatever it is. And so when they find out, like, we're moving CAD systems, no way, I can't, like, I'm not learning a new CAD system. And it's interesting because if users aren't on board with the plan and they don't understand why the company is doing this, and they're pretty much just forced to accept it, it can be really hard. Just like you said, the users don't trust it. So one thing that we really strongly encourage when it comes to a CAD migration is that users are brought in early to understand what's happening and also be a part of, like, the feedback when they run those tests. Because we'll find that if people are, very against the idea, they're going to find all kinds of things wrong with it because it's never perfect. A
Right.
feature-based migration is never going to be perfect. So, they're going to have this long list of reasons that this is, problematic. This isn't the same. That's going to cause me a lot of rework. But if they understand the why behind and they're brought in and they can bring that expertise in early, it actually helps the success overall because they feel, like valued as part of the project. And then, they're brought in early enough to where they don't feel like something was dumped on them. So I know that was a different point than what you were talking about, but that
Still
just,
valid, though.
It just reminded me so much how that comes into play. Of users kind of having to sort of face it and accept it too late in the plan. So that's something we learn and definitely advocate to our customers to try and bring awareness, encourage participation and get those experts, as part of the project where they can help. So
you bring up a really, really good point. I mean, a lot of times we talk on this show about the importance of people in using technology, because it's our tendency as engineers, as computer scientists to, like, focus on the technology. And once I got the right tool, then I'm good. It's like, no, it's the people are actually a whole lot more complex than any technology or process.
Yeah, and I had not thought about, I'm sorry, Jen, I cut you off.
No, that's right. Probably won't be the last time.
Definitely not the first.
Definitely not the first. Go ahead.
I was going to say, as Annalise was describing that, and the point you made about the people, right? We think organizational change management is a big deal on a lot of the projects that we do, and certainly in any kind of digital transformation it is. But just those points you described, Annalise, bring it home to me. I missed that on the CAD conversion topic initially. When you mentioned religion, I'm like, yeah, that's exactly right. People do think about this stuff like it's a religion. And if you don't take the time to work on that, to talk about that, to discuss the why, to hear them out early on, you're going to miss something, and you may end up with a failed project as a result.
Yeah.
I'm curious, and I'd like to hear from both of you on this. Like, how often do you see companies doing both at the same time? You know what? Not only are we going from, say, Creo to CATIA, but we also want to move from Windchill to 3DX. So you have to do both the CAD data translation and the PLM migration at the same time. How would that?
I'll say from my side, I don't see that a lot, right? I've seen it a couple of times, but I have not seen that as much. How about you, Annalise?
Well, that's interesting because we wouldn't see a case when they're just caring about PLM migration necessarily.
Right.
But we would know, like, if CAD is a point, then whether or not PLM is also changing. And I would say it does vary, but I want to roughly estimate probably half the time.
Okay.
Whereas they're actually migrating both. or at least going from no PLM to a PLM. So I think at least half the time, both are in play. There are some cases where the PLM system doesn't change, and it's just a CAD conversion. But at least half.
But I'm curious, even in that case, because you had said earlier, going back to what you had said earlier, you have them take it out of the PLM system, do the conversion, and then put it back in the PLM system. So even then, there are some that you're sharing some of the same aspects of like extracting and then reloading the data.
Right.
So
yeah, and we don't touch the PLM part of the equation really much at all. So I would say, since we're really just focused on the CAD itself, either the customer is kind of taking that on, or obviously working with a company like Razorleaf to do that part of the project, of course. So that export, re-import, or whether it's the same PLM system or two different PLM systems, either one comes up. But I kind of think that two different PLM systems are half, and then no PLM to a new PLM is probably the next largest. And same PLM, but just migrating CAD is probably the smallest, but it does come up. So
that's interesting. I'll mention a special case that I've seen once or twice, right? When I say I don't see this a lot, one that I've seen that I find very interesting is a customer who is doing that change of both, but they want to not actually convert the CAD data history, right? So I'll describe the scenario. It'll probably make more sense than me trying to talk around it. But they say, okay, I've got this CAD data, let's say it's in Inventor, and I'm going to go to Creo as part of loading it up into Smart Team. Okay. Mm-hmm. So their process is, I've got all this Inventor data that's historically, I don't think I'm going to edit it, but I want to be able to work on the files going forward. So I'm not going to go back in history to edit anything, and I want to load it because I need it. Say I'm a med device maker and I need the history, right? And I need to see how it happened. Okay, so we're gonna take the latest version of the Inventor data and we're gonna convert it feature-based to Creo. And when we load it into PLM, we're gonna load that history of Inventor, and we need that last record to actually be the Creo version so that somebody going in can see that full version history. They want to see everything from the regulatory perspective is there, but they want to just pick up and go with the Creo format moving forward. So I've seen that, and I think it's an interesting blend of those, but it just goes right back to what you said earlier, Annalise, about requirements. If you understand what somebody's trying to accomplish, you may have to put a lot of pieces of this together in unique ways.
Exactly. I like that example for that exact reason. It demonstrates an understanding of requirements, and therefore the solution is very tailored to fit those requirements. And
yeah. And I think it also speaks to finding an expert when you need to do this, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons why we wanted to have you on this episode, right? Is there are lots of folks who have expertise in the specific areas that you need to deal with. And when you understand your requirements, then you also need to understand how to partner with somebody, bring somebody in that gets it, that understands the requirement. They know how to sort of pull those requirements out of the customer and say, well, do you mean this or do you mean that? Because it's going to matter to what result you get. And you need folks who understand the nature of the data. You mentioned it earlier, right? You said, this data is very valuable. It's an important asset. So you have to know what you're doing with it, and you have to deal with it with the appropriate level of care to get the result you want.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to keep an eye on our time as usual, and we are running right up against our abusing our listeners' a time they can allocate to this. So, as so many times, I feel like we've just barely scratched the surface, and because data translation is a large part of my history, I think it would be great to actually have an entire podcast just on the ins and outs of doing a CAD migration or CAD translation. So perhaps
we could have a lot of good chat about process, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So perhaps, Annalise, if you would like to come back and visit us, we could have you back again.
Anytime. Would love to.
Okay. Well, it sounds like just to wrap up today, it sounds like there are a lot of similarities about the process and the overarching way that you go about things, the things you have to consider, there's a lot of differences in the types of data and the tools and some of the complexity. But I think there's a lot more similarities than there are differences. So, and clearly, to your point, Annalise, the data is critical, and getting it right is very important. So,
yeah.
I want to thank you for being on our podcast today.
Thank you very much, Annalise.
Yeah.
Likewise.
Yeah.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
And, if anybody has any questions on things that we covered today, things we didn't cover today, or other things that you would like to hear about, please reach out on social media. Let us know. Be part of the conversation. We'd love to hear from you. And thank you, Jonathan, remembering this time for joining us. And until next time, everybody, stay sharp.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for being here and listening to this episode of Stay Sharp with Razorleaf. If you have any lingering questions from this podcast, we'd love to answer it for you. Just leave a comment on our post or send an email to podcast@razorleaf.com. We appreciate all the feedback we receive. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, stay sharp.